As we continue to go through with all of these diplomatic efforts and meetings in Alaska, meetings in the White House, discussions about future meetings, bilateral with President Putin and President Zelensky, trilateral, adding in President Trump to that. Who's going to give away? Is there going to be security guarantees? Are there going to be Western troops in Ukraine? All of these things are taking up a lot of oxygen, and everybody's paying a lot of attention to that. Certainly we're covering it as well, because that's, those are the things that are going on as we try to get the Russia-Ukraine war wound down. And while all that is critically important, it can't be talked about unless it's also in direct conjunction with what happens on the ground. One of the things that's kind of a hallmark of what we've been talking about throughout this war is that people can say whatever they want at the diplomatic level or the political level, or they can make whatever claims they want on TV, but everything has to go through the sieve of reality on the ground. So you can't talk about one without the other if you're interested in an actual realistic outcome. So today, I want to go through this morning here and discuss a little bit more about what's happening on the ground. All right, first of all, let's take a look at the most important issue. We've been telling you this for many, many weeks now, that according to Russian sources that we've interviewed on this show here, the priority of effort, the main effort for the Russians in the entire Eastern Front is the Pokrovsk sector. There's all kinds of things going on in the south, in Zaporizhia, up in the northern part, in the Kupiansk, and elsewhere in the Konstantinivka area, but everything hinges on the Pokrovsk area. And that you can see that on the map right there. Well, as we discussed before, I went on my latest trip. Right before I left, the Russians had made a pretty good breakthrough and made a penetration that's between 18 and 20 kilometers deep, which was the biggest penetration they had made in the last 2 years of conflict. In fact, probably since the opening rounds of the war, they hadn't made that big of a push anywhere since. And the big question that we had at that time was, will this lead to a general breakthrough? Were the Russians prepared to have exploitation forces to take advantage of this opportunity and push potentially deeper into the Ukrainian rear? A lot has happened since then. And actually, I want to kind of do an update on this entire portion of the front here and this operation, what the Ukraine side has done in response to the Russian penetration and what may be coming next. What you're going to see is that the balance continues to shift in the Russian side. Now, it's not a big, at this point anyway, it's not a big break. It looks like it could have been. In fact, it looks like it's going to be a marginal success for the Russian side. The problem is for the Ukraine side, many other elements of this indicate that the whole front continues to get more brittle, and we don't know when the next break could be the big one. But there is no evidence so far, just kind of a spoiler alert, that the Ukraine defensive capability is going to be able to stop anything, whether here or in some of the other places. They have slowed it down here, but as you're about to see, it does continue forward even to this day. First of all, let me show you that this is the tactical situation as of the 15th of July. So this is where the front lines were, and you can see Pokrovsk and Mirnograd there, the kind of the sister city up to the northeast of it. That was in a semi-cauldron already, and that TO 515 and the E50 roads there you see to the north and to the west. Those were the primary reinforcement and resupply lines and roads for the whole agglomeration and everything that's inside of the Ukraine side. That's what they have used to get reinforcements in, medical supplies, and other people to get medical help out, etc. So obviously the issue for Ukraine is they need to keep that corridor open. They need to keep those lines open if they have any chance and hope to hold Pokrovsk and Mirnograd against the Russian advance. Now, things started to shift a little bit in early July when the Russians started taking some operations to prepare for something bigger to come. And as Alex talks about here, one of the reasons I say that this is showing some potential more cracks all across the front, not just here, was that there appears to be a shift in the drones. We've talked many times in recent months about the fact that the drones were at a relative parity. We've talked to people who have fought and reported on both sides of the line, and they were similar in their views that the drone fight at the tactical level, drones I'm talking about, not the strategic ones, was at a relative parity for the two sides, and both of them really had to worry about it. But as Alex points out here, evidence is starting to show that the balance is starting to shift in Russia's side.
Ukrainians sent drone after drone to strike enemy units positioned there. However, in the past few months, the Ukrainians have lost their edge on drone warfare. And it was now Russian drone operators that were hammering Pokrovsk, targeting anything going in and out of the city. In this video, you can see them strike armored vehicles like a Swedish-made BVS-10, a Cossack APC, a Turkish-made Kirpi, but also dozens of cars and pickup trucks. They also systematically cleared the sky of enemy drones and destroyed numerous relay antennas. Although FPV drones look spectacular, Russian artillery was still the king of battle and caused heavy casualties by dropping massive loads all over the front.
So a couple of things that are really important there is one, that you see Russia is advancing in their the way they apply drones. It's not now just FPV drones and they go and blow up stuff, but now then they're actually being very selective in their target array. So they're still going after armored vehicles. And by the way, you understand that whereas Russia has all this defense industrial capacity where they can repair or build new armored vehicles, the Ukraine side and the Western side is much more limited. And I don't even remember the last time I heard about any big number of armored vehicles being donated by the West and given to Ukraine. And they do have some ability to repair and to even build some, but it's far, far less than what the Russian side is. Obviously, they're a much smaller country, and their air defense capacity is very, very limited. And so Russia is constantly bombing any factories that they have, whereas Russia is so spread out, and obviously Ukraine doesn't have the ability to strike as much deep into Russia as Russia does. So they're going to maintain that edge there. Every time you keep seeing those kind of drones take out all these armored vehicles, many of which came from the European countries, or even just vehicles and cars and whatever else, most of those are zero sum. It's very difficult to get those back in the fight. So even though this is not like one of those big armored dashes like we saw in World War II, or even that I participated in Desert Storm, where we had big armored formations that move forward, that's not the case right now because of the drone warfare, but they still are vital. I keep talking about this. You still have to have armored vehicles to move around because, just getting in a truck or a vehicle like the kind you saw there, those things can get hit and then everybody gets, killed or wounded inside there. At least with the armored vehicle, you have some protection even against some of these FPV drones. The second thing you saw there that I thought was really interesting, you see an increasing number of drone against drone capacity. So, of course, Russia has been trying to affect, and both sides have, the other with electronic warfare means to knock them out of the sky or to render them useless so that they just fall from the sky or don't hit their target. Now Russia's adding to that anti-drone warfare from the drones themselves. And so they're knocking enemy drones out of the sky. I've been reading these big Baba Yaga drones, which we've featured in a previous episode of ours, where we talked about these big, massive, big old drones by the Ukraine side. They call them Baba Yagas because it scared a lot of the Russians because they can drop not just those little hand grenades, but they can drop actually anti-tank mines, which are massive. And so that's a big concern. But apparently those are now getting hit a lot more frequently and knocked out by the Russian side by multiple means, so as that the limit is the effectiveness. And so that's one of the reasons I think that Alex mentions that the balance, the scales are starting to tip in Russia's favor. And of course, they already have favor advantages, as that last clip showed there, still in artillery and rocket artillery. So those things continue to come in. Russia has somewhere between 4 and 5 times more ammunition for all of those weapon systems than the Ukraine side does. And obviously that is also going to continue to elevate the casualties on the Ukraine side. And that is also having an effect on this fight here. Continuing on here, it's not just the drones and even the artillery that's going on, but there has also been, and this gets hardly any coverage in the West here. They like to talk about these big drone raids that go both from Ukraine into Russia and Russia into Ukraine, because they have dramatic video footage there of oil fields burning and all that kind of stuff. But there have been a lot less focus, the fact that Russia seems to be using its air power at the tactical front a lot more than it used to, as this report shows.
A brilliant analyst on Twitter called Clément Molin. According to his post, he recorded 450 Russian airstrikes between the 11th and the 21st of July. The majority of them northeast of Pokrovsk. This means the Russian Air Force was literally plowing through Ukrainian defenses. Many are criticizing the Ukrainians for not putting enough infantrymen in these fortifications. But what's the point? You can deploy an entire infantry platoon in one of these bastions and then FAB 500 will just wipe them out.
So that was 450 airstrikes just from the 11th to the 21st of July. That is a huge concentration. And apparently, according to that graphic, that was only in the area around Pokrovsk. You could see there was many other strikes elsewhere on the front, in the Konstantinivka area, et cetera, and then all the way off the map there. So we don't know how many they have. But if they're having that many just there, you can imagine that the Russian air power is really, really stepping it up. And most of these, if not all of them, are glide bombs. And that's one of the categories of weapons that the Ukraine side doesn't even have. Now, I have seen some reports and elsewhere in that video from Alex, he talks about that the Ukrainian Air Force is still active in the tactical fight. So they have found a way to get up in the air as well, but they just have a lot fewer of them. They have a much, much smaller number of sorties, and they have standard missiles that, air-to-ground missiles, which are useful, but they don't have the glide bombs, because the glide bombs can be massive in their striking power, so much bigger than what a standard air-to-ground missile would be. But it's not enough to even have an effect really on what's happening on the ground, whereas the Russian side obviously is. That's a big issue. So that was as of the 21st of July. That was around. So you could see that Russia was going through methodically, whether it was with drones, whether it was with air power, or with some of these infiltration tactics, that they were shooting areas all around the rear and the flanks of the Pokrovsk area, apparently getting ready for something to happen on the ground. Well, that started actually on the 22nd of July. We saw that for the first time, what's called DRG, and if you hear that it's an acronym for something in Russian, but basically it means reconnaissance and sabotage group. So it's a small contingent. It could be as few as 2 or 3 people, sometimes a little bit bigger, but not too much, because that way that you can just have a handful of people infiltrate and get into certain areas without being seen, and then whatever they can carry, they can get into deeper into the area. Those started making movements and got into the Pokrovsk area, the city itself, on the 22nd of July.
This is the situation, and this situation means and confirms several things. First of all, the Ukrainians currently have no strong control over the southwestern part of this area. The second thing is that the Russians are able to send more and more sabotage and reconnaissance group deep inside of the territory of Pokrovsk, and the most important, the Russians at the current situation are able during the daylight, not during the night period of time, but during a daylight, to create ambushes for Ukrainians, and this is the most important piece of news. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map softly. We have added a contested area between the settlements of Zverova, the settlement by the name of Leontovich, the settlement of Troyanda, and the central part of the city of Pokrovsk along the Zahisnikov Ukraine Street.
Around the time this attack was happening, shortly thereafter, there was an interview with one of the battalion commanders, the Ukrainian battalion commanders, on Ukrainian television. One of the presenters asked them, well, how did these Russians get through there? I mean, how did they get that far into the sound? And he just kind of shook his head and said, we just don't have enough men to defend everything. We keep hearing about this. I've been showing you how Julian Rybka for months now has been talking about specifically this issue. He says the Ukraine side just doesn't have enough manpower to be able to adequately defend the areas that it has. There's been entire portions of the built-up areas where the trenches and the other fortifications, they didn't have enough people to even man them all, even when they had good ones. And then he specifically said in some of the cities, in an area, maybe you need 12, you only had 3 or 4 guys, etc. So that means that the Ukraine side and their command is having to pick and choose what they're going to defend. And so they're going to put some here, some there. And ideally, and I can tell you from personal experience, what you try to do is you have interlocking fires and you have continuance of visibility and sight lines all along the front. So if I'm in one defensive position here, I have sight lines, maybe 500 meters here, maybe 300 meters here, and I can have this target here, so I can cover this area here. Meanwhile, the guy over to my flank there, he's got his own little fan here where he can cut across there. And so you have the sight lines cross. That way you have complete coverage. Even if you don't have enough troops to cover everything, you have sight lines, and so you can bring under fire anything that may come in that area. But if you don't have enough troops even for that, then you have gaps. And if they're smart, and they probably are, because the Ukraine side has shown they're very, very creative in how they use these few troops they have, they'll probably move them around so that the enemy can't figure that out. But it doesn't matter if there's going to be gaps. And if you have enough of these DRG groups coming in, they'll find the gaps. And that's exactly what happened here. So Ukraine simply doesn't have enough manpower to provide for a continuous defense along the entire area of the city. And so these DRG groups have been able to get in. Okay, so that was as of the 22nd of July. But from the 22nd of July to the 8th of July, there continued to be more and more of these attacks with the air power, with the drones, certainly rocket attacks, artillery attacks, etc. They continued to soften up the area. That was classic Soviet doctrine, which I studied back when I was in Germany and was preparing potentially for a Soviet advance into the Fulda Gap, etc. We used to study that kind of stuff. And that was what they would do. They would use a lot of air, especially artillery, to try and hit command and control centers, troop locations, anything where they thought. And as you saw, and there's some of these FAB bombs are coming in when, because obviously with satellite imagery or drones, you can see where nearly all the trenches are. A lot of them are covered up by trees, but you can't cover them all up by trees, and those are the targets where they're hitting in there. So they continue to weaken the troops more and more there. But as Alex also showed here, that the casualties that they're causing, that's one big problem. But as it turns out, there's another problem for the UAF.
Here we have a story of two soldiers that enlisted because of the 18 to 24-year-old recruitment campaign, explaining how they escaped encirclement near Pokrovsk. What's interesting is how in the story was said that out of the 12-man squad, only these two were volunteers. How I interpret it is how everyone else was probably a mobic. Alright, here's a $1 million question. What happens when you forcefully enlist civilians and send them to the front without any training? That's right, desertion. According to sort of reports, the AFU suffered from a catastrophic desertion crisis since December 2024. We're talking about 135,800 desertions, almost 17,000 per month. And that explains Ukraine's manpower crisis. Everyone they mobilize, half of them become casualties in the first weeks, and the other half deserts.
So you see that's why the Ukrainian side has insufficient troops to cover everything. All of these glide bombs and artillery, etc., and the DRG groups and the people penetrating through all the different areas, all that does is continue to cause casualties. But then when you also have desertions, because these guys, Gary has shown you a ton of times over months how these guys are literally grabbed off the street, beaten many times. Many of them are actually even being killed inside of these centers where they bring them in, the recruitment centers, so-called. Or sometimes even on the street. It's just a terrible situation. So the ones that don't get killed or beat up, they end up getting up there and they don't want to fight. They believe, many of them, obviously, that this is an unwinnable war and that they're literally throwing their lives into the trash if they continue to follow through. So they desert at the first opportunity. And according to this, and this was confirmed to me in another source on a Ukrainian Telegram channel in a public forum, that there are that one reported 135,000. This Ukrainian one reported 125,000 that were actually by name list because these guys were under indictment or there were warrants out for their arrest because they deserted their post, and so they're looking for them, etc. That's somewhere, depending on which number's right, somewhere around 690 per day this calendar year. And you saw in that graph there this big spike starting in December. It's just a huge spike. It's just unbelievable numbers. I mean, when you're losing not just who knows what the actual number is, but somewhere between 700 and 1,300 killed or wounded per day, and then you add on top of that another possibly up to 700 desertions, you can see that the fabric is just, it can't do anything but continue to thin out. So back to the Pokrovsk area. So from the 22nd of July through the 8th of August, the Russians continued with all of the aerial bombardment, but also they started in the north, the east, and the south Pokrovsk, having these infiltration tactics to try and find penetration routes, to try to find holes in the defense, etc. Well, then on the 8th of August, there was another big push, and from the 8th to the 12th, that's when we had this first big breakthrough. And here's how Military Summary talked about it.
This is just the beginning. By the end of the 9th of August of 2025, the Russians began their offensive, and during the first day of their offensive operation, we got just a short report about additional progress on the ground in the northern direction. So nothing special, the regular picture that we used to see almost every single day before the beginning of this offensive. But on the 10th of August, we received first report that shown us significant progress on the ground. As you can see, by the end of the 10th of August of 2025, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the area of the settlement by the name of Rodinskaya. More precisely, the Russians cut the settlement of Rodinskaya and the northern part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration from the mainland. At the same time, the armed force of the Russian Federation began advancing along the railways in the area of the settlement of Dorozhny. A lot of very heavy clashes were recorded in this area. And of course, the most important is that the Russians began their offensive operation in the northern direction, which was the most unexpected, both for pro-Russian resources and of course for pro-Ukrainian resources and of course for Ukrainian authorities.
Now, here's what we've been able to piece together since that. That was as of that video was made on the 12th of August. And then by the 14th of August, Russia had opened up 2 corridors here. That kind of showed the startings of one, but there ended up being 2. Some people call them look like rabbit ears kind of thing, where the Russians had gone up in 2 separate corridors up into the, deeper into the Ukraine line. That got up to 18 kilometers from the start point on the 8th. So it was a huge, huge penetration. Now, at the time, my first open question was, did Russia have the ability to reinforce with exploitation forces? We've been told by Ukrainian sources for months that there was these large formations of Russian forces out of contact, that if there was a breakthrough, they were prepared to exploit them and move forward. So that was what I thought was the most dangerous for the Ukraine side, is that if Russia had made these movements, that then they had exploitation forces before Ukraine could reinforce and to try to cut the penetrations off, that they would bring that through. And then there would be, may not even be a chance to stop them afterwards, because after you penetrate through that last line of fortifications, if you have to fight them in open terrain, that gives all the advantages to the Russian side, because there's nothing for you to hide behind like there are when you have the defensive line that you had built up. But as it turned out, the Russians, at least to this moment, have still not done that. So that we don't know right now what the reasons for that is. Did Russia really not have the exploitation force? I've seen one report that says that this action by the Russian side here was not coordinated with higher command authorities, and they were not prepared for a breakthrough, and they were not prepared to exploit one. I can't say whether that's true or not, but what we can say is that the immediate reaction of the Ukraine side was to move several brigades from the Azov Corps and a number of others. I think there was a total of 4 brigades that were brought in to counterattack to try and stop the Russian penetration, which starting on the 15th, they succeeded at doing. So there hasn't been any additional penetration in that northern direction from that time, and the Ukraine side has brought its reinforcements, its strategic reserve to block that. Now, the danger for the Ukraine side is that appears to be, if not the last, one of the last reinforcement formations of that size that can stop any penetration. And to get them there, they had to pull them out of another area. From one report I saw shows that it came from the Konstantinivka area. So we'll see what that happens. In the past, when Ukraine's had to pull troops off of one part of the front to fill a hole in one part, then that part actually started seeing some more movement forward. We'll see if that happens as well. One of the questions, apparently, by the way, these penetrations were not made by regular formations, regular Russian army battalions and companies, etc., but by more of these DRG and small groups. which means that to get this rapid penetration, they had to sometimes bypass defensive positions where there were Ukrainian troops in, and they had to move on beyond those. Now, one of the things the Russians were doing was they were trying to reinforce and resupply them by drones, by friendly drones. They would go in and drop supplies behind the enemy lines. There was potentially up to about 150 Russian troops in this. Now, that may sound like a lot, but that's basically one infantry company, and it's not that much. And when you're talking an area of 18 kilometers that was deep and I think 7 kilometers wide at its biggest part, that is a very small number. And you can't, you take this area rapidly, but when you bypass enemy strong points there, that means that you can't follow it up, and anybody who's going to try to come and help you behind that also has to fight through those strong points. And as it turned out, that was enough to slow down the Russians, and then the Ukraine side brought in its reserves. Now, whether this was a movement by a Russian leader at the tactical level that saw an opportunity and took it and didn't coordinate this, whether it was coordinated and they just weren't able to follow it up, I can't say. But what we can say from looking at what happened here is that Russians didn't follow it up. So the penetration was basically stopped on the 14th or 15th of August, and the Ukraine side penetrated some of those corridors I talked about. According to Deep State map, they cut those off. But now then, according to what we see today, let me pull up. This is current as of today, as of a couple of hours ago. You see that whereas there are now no longer 2 of these corridors, there were 2, the Ukraine side did take back this part of it, this one. This is now in the contested zone instead of Russian control, but the Russian side has been reinforced here and actually has gone a little bit further here. Also, in the last 24 hours, Russia has moved up further to Volodymyrivka and Shakhova, these 2 villages in this area here. Russia is continuing to move. You see they've moved into the gray zone, Shakhova down here, and they're moving up closer to Volodymyrivka, etc. And they took this area here. This moved from the contested into the Russian zone. So they are continuing to move up here, but it just shows that the Russians are not moving very fast. But it also shows that the Ukraine side, which is generally in this area here, these 4 brigades are scattered throughout here to prevent any further attack, especially when you get into Rodinska. There was some risk that the road right here, one of the 2 routes into Pokrovsk, to keep them, the Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, there for a while there was some Russians right up to the road. That has been pushed back, but you see down at Rodinska, now then there is into the gray zone. Let me zoom in a little bit here, and you can see that in the outskirts of the town there are now fights inside Rodinska. So it's not going to be much more till they can cut this off. Whether they cut it off up here or cut it off down here and prevent this from being used to supply the rest of the Ukrainian garrison inside the agglomeration, doesn't make any difference. It's still something they have to be concerned with. Meanwhile, you see that the Ukraine side has not been able to eject all of the Russians. So even though they still have some of these small DRG groups, they are still active inside Pokrovsk, and they own the area right up to the edge of it here. And so that continues to show the continual problem of the Ukraine side, in that they don't have the ability, because they don't have enough troops, to eject Russian once they get into an area. They have slowed them down. They can't stop them. Why the Russians weren't able to really pour troops through there, I don't know. But you might even say that is a limitation on the Russian side. But we're talking about a war of attrition here. This is what is so vital to understand, and what it appears the Russians do understand. In a war of attrition, it matters who can wear down the other side. And if you are not in a hurry, if you can say, hey, time is on my side, I don't have to rush troops through here. Maybe I wish I could have done it faster, but I didn't. But what we did continues to move the line westward. It continues to kill Ukrainian troops. They continue to have a massive difficulty replacing losses. You saw in that one example there where Alex gave, where there were only 2 volunteers of young, strong fighting age. Everybody else was forced mobilized. And you got to know that the volunteers, as is all of them on the Russian side so far are, they're much more motivated to fight than the guys who were terrified and didn't want to go and tried to run, tried to escape, and were grabbed off the streets and said, they're not going to fight well. And you see many of them abandon the battlefield. So now then that kind of brings us back to, where is this at the diplomatic level? So Vladimir Putin met with Steve Witkoff, a couple of weeks back. That spawned a visit between Trump and Putin. So now then they had that conversation. Now then that spawned a meeting between Trump and Zelensky, and Trump and the European leaders. And that's supposed to now lead to a meeting between a bipartisan meeting between bilateral meeting between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky, and then a trilateral meeting that would then have Putin, Zelensky, and Trump. And then all this is hoping to get to an end of war. And all these other things that are going in the background about, are there going to be Western troops as part of a peacekeeping force? Are there going to be security guarantees for Ukraine? Will the war come to an end? Will they have to exchange territories? And by exchange, that means, will Russia leave territories they really don't want, like in Sumy and Kharkiv area, so that they get all the areas that they desperately want, which is the 4 oblasts that they annexed in 2022? And will Ukraine withdraw from those, et cetera? Those are huge sticking points. Now, it doesn't look like that Russia is in a hurry. In fact, President Putin, after saying that he is categorically interested and willing to talk to anyone, now then is not nailing down, because people keep trying to say, okay, you said you would meet, according to what Trump said when he was visiting, when the Zelensky and the European leaders were in the Oval Office. He left the meeting, as you may have seen, got on the phone with Putin for 40 minutes, then came back to the meeting. And at least what was reported afterwards was that Trump got concurrence from Putin that he'll meet with Zelensky. But now then, since that time, when people are asking Kremlin leaders and others in the government, when is that meeting going to be? Russia's saying, well, we'll see about that. There's a lot of things that have to go into that, because, I mean, we have to talk at other levels first, and we need to have, some senior leaders get together at the the senior level, but less than heads of state, to iron things out so that there's something useful to be done at those two. And obviously you're not going to get the trilateral meeting until you get the bilateral meeting taken care of. But Russia seems to be, we'll get to it when we get to it. Because I think when you look at how all of this stuff is unfolding, we got to understand something. For all these people and we showed you on one of our shows yesterday, that there's lots in the United States that are claiming that Trump coerced Putin into a meeting, and these economic sanctions finally brought him to the table, etc. That's a lot of just self-congratulations and building up our own side and making us sound bigger than we are, and not listening to the Russian side, not paying attention to the battlefield. You've got to do all of those things, because I still, to this day, cannot imagine that Putin is going to say, sure, if you'll leave the Donbass area, Luhansk and Donetsk, then we'll just freeze the line in Zaporizhia and Kherson, because that would be a stab in the back to the people in those two provinces from the Russian side who wanted to be Russian. If all of a sudden Putin is going to say, yeah, we promised that you're going to all be in Russian territory one day, we put it in our constitution, but yeah, never mind, we'll just freeze it right here, and all y'all on the other side of the line there, good luck to you. I mean, that I just don't think Putin would be able to survive politically. It's funny because, of the hope of so many in the West was that the economic sanctions would cause the people to rise up against Putin, or that the casualties that they suffer would make people, demand that he end the war, et cetera, or that the economy itself would collapse and then he would be forced into making concessions, et cetera. None of those things happened. But the one thing that possibly could get Putin's grip on power at question is if, from a position of strength, he handed away something to the other side, which not only would abandon ethnic Russian people, it would also prevent all the rest of the ethnic Russians on the other side of the line from having any kind of legal protections, which is one of the things that the Russians talk about all the time that they need. And it would mean that you have the ability to demand these concessions by the West, and that you didn't take it. And that just wouldn't go. That's just not Russian. And I doubt very seriously that they're going to entertain anything like that. What I rather think is that they'll just continue to talk about talk. They'll continue to meet at some level, and may even agree to meet at some presidential level. But I think only if Putin can be reasonably assured that Zelensky is showing up to make an agreement that's satisfactory to Putin. It's just hard for me to imagine Putin ever agreeing to a meeting with Zelensky, which is something Zelensky's been trying to get for a long time. He's been mocking Putin for not talking directly to him, etc. So just meeting with Putin would be a success for Zelensky, especially if he could meet him and not give anything away to him, come off looking kind of big and strong, like, yeah, I went toe to toe with with Putin and didn't give in to his, demands. I looked him square in the eye and all this kind of stuff. That would be a huge win for Zelensky and would get even more support for him. Certainly Russians are aware of that. And I just cannot imagine a situation where Putin would take that risk unless he knew for certain, or something close to that Zelensky was showing up hat in hand and is going to be willing to sign whatever was already agreed to before. Right now, Zelensky's not close to doing that. Right now, if they met, Zelensky probably would try to go in your face and stand toe-to-toe and all that and give in nothing, because then he comes out as a winner. Only Putin would lose if they come together and nothing happens. But if Putin can delay that and instead keep actions on the battlefield like this going on, and especially when you add in there the strategic drone war and the missile launches, which have been going, by the way, both sides. It doesn't get talked about in the Western press much, but it's not just Russia attacking Ukraine, but vice versa. Ukraine has had some success hitting some important oil facilities of the Russian side here in just recent days and causing some real damage at some military outposts, etc. But in comparison, it's much, much smaller than the Russian side has. And the Russian side has been building its capacity. And it's not out of the question that these things could be ramped up at a time of Russia's choosing to maybe 700, 800, 900, 1,000 per day over a sustained period of time. Right now, it's kind of in the mid to low hundreds. They've kind of sustained that for a while, which is causing a lot of damage. And this last round here in Odessa, in the Sumy region, caused some serious damage because the Ukraine side just doesn't have enough air defense to stop that. And Russia does have enough to saturate what limited air defense they have, and it gets through and causes this damage. Now, if that volume goes up at the same time it goes up on the battlefield, then you see you could get to a point to where Russia may have a chance to have a breakthrough somewhere. And of course, that's when you have a chance for the Ukraine side to finally be willing to make a negotiated settlement. My estimation at this time, on the 21st of August, is that until Russia is able to break through somewhere and actually put at risk the continuity of the Ukraine armed forces, then I doubt that Zelensky is going to be willing to give away anything, and therefore I doubt Putin is going to be willing to host a meeting with him. So we'll see how that turns out. Trump's trying to get it done right now. He wants an immediate. He wants it by the end of the month. So, which is obviously you don't have much time left on that. So we'll see how all this plays out here. But that's the situation. I wanted to make sure you had a good comprehensive understanding of how everything at the diplomatic, political, strategic, operational, and tactical level of what's happening on the ground and in the air is all intertwined. And you can't take one part without looking at the whole thing here. And that's your show for today. Thank you very much, folks. Appreciate it. We'll be back with you later this afternoon on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.